Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. In this week's episode, it's all about tenant-occupied properties. I'm going to give you 5 tips if you're considering selling a rental unit, but also if you're a tenant yourself or you're considering buying a property that currently has a tenant in it, you will find this video useful. Real quick before we get started, if this is your first time to the channel, my name is Hassan. I'm a real estate agent in the Vancouver area, and I make educational real estate content to help you safely navigate the real estate market. I also make content designed to help you make your move in and around Vancouver. So if that sounds interesting to you and you want to talk about your own situation with me one-on-one, you can book me for a free call in the Calendly link below. But regardless, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a future video. So before I get rolling on the content of this video, just want to preface why we're going to talk about it today. If you've watched my previous videos, you've heard a lot of talk about real estate supply and how real estate supply has dwindled, but also how interest rates being increased at such a rapid level has caused an influx of tenant-occupied properties to hit the market. For myself and my clients, I'm having so many more conversations with rental investors who perhaps have had tenants in their properties for a long period of time. With the interest rate increases, they're no longer able to cover the expenses of that unit, and very many of them, a lot of them are basically considering selling right now. When I look at the MLS and I'm constantly looking at new listings hit the market, I'm seeing so many more that are showing as tenant-occupied properties hitting the market. So I believe that today and going forward throughout the rest of the year, tenant-occupied property is going to be one of the most commonly listed properties. If you currently own a rental unit right now, you're possibly considering what your options are. And so we're going to talk about 5 tips if you're going to sell one of these units, how you can do it effectively, because in all honesty, they are trickier units to sell. Anytime you have a tenant in that property, it becomes a little bit more difficult, but at the end of this video, it's going to be a lot easier for you to make the decision and get that property sold for a good price. So the first thing that you want to do if you're in that situation where you're considering moving or selling a tenant-occupied property, a rental unit that you have, of course, you want to talk to your agent first, someone that you can trust, get some actual advice in terms of what you can and can't do with this tenant-occupied property. There are so many nuances when you have a rental unit that you're selling. You need to be cognizant of things such as what sort of term you have left on that rental agreement, that tenancy agreement. That's going to have a direct impact on the price you're going to get for your unit and who's going to be interested in purchasing it. For example, I had someone call me a couple weeks back. They said they wanted to sell their rental unit. They had placed a tenant in there in April on a 1-year term. So we still have several months to go, almost a full year to go before that term is expired. Now, when you have a tenant in place that's on a term like that, they cannot get moved out until that term is over. So when you list a property like that, you're basically just targeting investors to purchase that property, people that aren't going to move in themselves. So you basically shrink your buying pool considerably, especially in today's market with rates are where they're at. So in that instance, what you want to do is you want to really look at your tenancy term, how much longer is on that term. And that's going to kind of dictate your decision, what you're going to do as a next step. So talk to your realtor, make sure you're getting good, sound advice. Make sure your realtor is not scared to tell you that now is not the right time. That's what I had to tell this client, that, in this sort of environment, you're going to be leaving a lot of money on the table. You're probably going to have to sell at a steep discount. Now, there are a couple of things that you want to do or you can do, and this is kind of the next step after you talk to your realtor, is you want to talk to your tenant early on in the process. Once you've decided that you're very likely to go down this route, your next call is to that tenant and you want to candidly explain what your scenario is. So what I mean by that is when you call the tenant, if the reason you're thinking of selling is because you can no longer carry the expenses, again, which is happening to a lot of people right now. Here in BC, we're allowed to raise rents 2.5% per year per the provincial government. And I don't need to tell you that that's not covering the increase in expenses that has happened with inflation. So have a candid call with your tenant and say, look, this is the scenario I'm in right now. I'm considering selling. I'm not sure what your feeling is on that. You have a couple of options before even going down the selling route. If it's something that you don't really want to do, you don't necessarily have a plan for that money, you want to put in a different property or a different investment, you can have a candid conversation and say, look, I'm not able to cover. Now you are able to do a couple things. Now we are only allowed to raise rents 2.5%. But there's nothing stopping you as a landlord and a tenant coming together and negotiating a new rent. If both parties sign off on it, you can do that. It's happening very commonly in this market. Usually the way it works is that landlord is calling the tenant saying, I'm going to be placing this home on the market. The tenant is realizing that if they are to get moved out of the home, they're going to be paying a substantially higher rent. And oftentimes the tenant is now going to the seller and saying, is there anything I can do? Can we agree on a new rental amount that would actually keep me in this property and keep you in this property? So you want to have that conversation early. The other thing, like I mentioned off the top, is selling tenant-occupied properties is always more difficult. It's just always a more difficult process, more difficult to show. They often don't show as well. It's tough to get in. Again, tenancy terms are going to have an effect on what sort of value you're going to get. Now, what some clients and tenants do choose to do in this scenario is come together and mutually agree to end the tenancy. Now, again, if both parties sign off, this can happen at any point during that tenancy agreement. If you're wondering why as a tenant you might do this or why a tenant might do this, is when you catch the headwinds that your unit is going to be sold, whether it's today or in 4 months from now when your 1-year term has expired and you're now on a month-to-month, it's looking like you're going to get displaced. If you were to agree on a number that made sense for you as a tenant and as a seller, it made sense for you to pay out, compensate the tenant for leaving early, they can make less of a rush decision into moving into a different property rather than at the end of their 1-year term, they're on a month-to-month and they're given two calendar months notice. So you want to have this conversation early on with the tenant. You want to be candid, be open, and be honest about your situation as to why you're selling. All right, so let's say you've now agreed that you're going to put this property on the market. You need to sell it. The next thing you want to do, and of course you want to talk to the tenant as well, is you want to hire professional cleaners to come into this property, maybe even on a consistent basis over a month or two, depending on how long this property is going to take to sell. Definitely you want to do it before showings and before photography. Look, this is not on all tenants, but a lot of tenants, they're not motivated to help this sale process in the sense that they're going to bend over backwards and spend hours cleaning their place, and nor should they have to do that. So as a seller, you need to take that responsibility on yourself, that I need to make sure that this home is as show ready as possible. So hire cleaners to come in there, again, before the showings, before the pictures for sure, and before those open houses. And perhaps periodically beyond that, you might want to bring them in. There may be other things that you want to do as well for the tenant in terms of an incentive, I guess, if you will. So gift cards, for example, for allowing us to show. Some landlords actually even credit a little bit. They take a little bit off the monthly rent while the property is being listed. You want to be as cooperative as possible with the tenant, because truthfully, as the tenant, they hold the key to getting the property sold. Now, myself as a realtor, I do a lot of this myself. So when I'm selling a tenant-occupied property, I know that my relationship with the tenant is equally, if not more important than my relationship with the seller in terms of getting the result that I need to get. So if I'm doing a showing, again, you have to give 24 hours notice, but some tenants are more flexible. They say, sure, come in a little bit earlier, doesn't matter, it's all good. I'll leave behind a gift card. I'll always try and appease the tenant in that sort of way. But as a seller to the tenant, landlord to tenant, you may want to incentivize in these other types of ways with the cleaners and perhaps gift card, maybe a small credit again while the property is listed. It's going to go a long way for when we need cooperation from the tenant to show, or for inspections or appraisers. They are more inclined to help us in that process. Now, the next thing that you want to make sure to do, and a lot of this falls on the real estate agent, is you want to accommodate the tenant schedule as much as possible. So the reason you want to do this, obviously, is it can be really challenging for a seller themselves to open the door all the time for showings. So what I try and do as a real estate agent, I'll work with the seller, of course, but I'll work with the tenant and I'll say, look, are there specific days and times that are easier for you to allow me to show the property? And I ask them to give me a couple of days and times during the week, and at least one or two on the weekend as well, where it's easier for them. Perhaps they already have some sort of social event that they go to on a weekly basis, or they go to school or work, whatever it is, they may not want to be around. And in fact, in an ideal scenario, you don't have the tenant in the place while you're showing the property. So there may be times that are just a little bit easier for the tenant. And again, the whole theme of this video is we want to make it as easy as possible for the tenant to show. So accommodate their schedule. That's again, it falls on your real estate agent. But if you are the seller and you're selling a rental unit, you're sitting down with your agent, you have to ask them, how are you going to make this easier on my tenant? Because you don't want a frustrated tenant during this process, right? They hold, they carry too much of a stronghold on that property. You know, if they're an unhappy tenant, they start to, pay their rent late. They start to care less about the property. You need a tenant that's as happy as possible in, let's be realistic, an unhappy situation for them. So accommodating the tenant is extremely important. As a real estate agent, I need to walk a fine line, because what you want to hear from your real estate agent is we have to do everything in our power for your best interest as a seller. Right? The tenant is not a client of ours. So we need to appease them so they are helping us do the best possible service for you as the seller. So you can see how the relationship works. We need to navigate that relationship to get you the best result. And so when you're talking to a real estate agent, ask them what their plan is. It's very different than selling a property, of course, that is vacant, but also very different than selling a property where the homeowners reside in the unit. There's more motivation. It's more of a team effort to sell that type of a property, whereas selling tenant-occupied property, at times it doesn't feel like a team effort, so you want to know that your real estate agent has a solid plan. Now, the next tip that I want to give you, and this kind of ties into that as well, it's true for all properties, but it's especially true for rental properties or tenant-occupied properties. You cannot overprice your unit. You just can't do it. And the reason why you can't overprice this type of a property is the longer that you sit on the market, the more demotivated the tenant is going to get to open the door to show. You got to think about it. This is a very disruptive process. When you're selling your own property, you're a seller, you live in the home, it's a little bit more exciting because you know what your future plans are. You get the family together over the weekend. Perhaps you go visit other friends and family during open houses. Even as a seller of your own property, the longer you sit on the market, I don't care who you are, your excitement level drops as a seller. And you start to get less and less excited when your real estate agent calls you and says, hey, I have to show tomorrow at 6 p.m. I know it's dinner time. This is a very interested party. I need to show. And that's, for example, the 15th, 20th, 25th showing on a property. You start to lose some motivation. And that's what happens when you overprice. Now, if you put yourself in the tenant shoes, they have less patience. They have less patience for the process. And oftentimes some tenants won't even open up the door to allow you in. Now, technically, legally, you have to give them 24 hours notice to get in, but it's not as if on the 25th hour you can come and break down the door and show the property. So overpricing the property, you might as well not even put it on the market, because you're going to sit there, you're going to frustrate your tenant, you're going to take it off the market, and now your tenant's going to be like, well, I may lose this property at any time, I'm not going to care about it. So that's a big danger with tenant-occupied properties. That's why it's important to work with a real estate agent who understands tenancy agreements, tenancy terms, and how that impacts the actual value of the unit. Because if they misprice the unit based on all of these factors, you're not going to sell, you're going to have an unhappy tenant. So price effectively, and the goal should be to sell quickly. All right, so the next tip I want to give you, and this is more of a general tip as a landlord, if you have a rental property, is you must raise the rent. You have to raise the rent every year, whatever the government allows you to raise it. So right now they allow you to raise it 2.5%, and you have to do it. And I'll tell you why. I also can understand the stories that I hear when I talk to people, my own clients. They say, look, I've had a great tenant in there for so long. They take great care of the place. I don't want to raise the rent. I haven't raised the rent in 10 years. It's a feel-good story. And I should preface this by saying, if you don't care about what your resale value is on that rental unit, whenever that might be, then sure, don't raise the rent. But if you want to protect the value of your asset, you have to raise that rent religiously, whatever you're allowed to raise it. If you asked me 5-7 years ago, I may not have said the same thing, but that discrepancy in rent now between new rents and what tenants are paying that have even been in there for a couple of years. I'll give you an example. Vancouver, average rent 2 years ago today on a one bedroom, about $2,000, $2,050. As it stands today, that one bedroom rent is touching $2,900. This is 2 years later, a 40% increase. The government has allowed us in that amount of time to raise the rents about 4.5%. You do the math. If you're not raising your rent, you're devaluing your asset as you go along. Now, when you go to sell, even if that client's on a month to month, if the rent is very low, they're paying way below market, no investor is going to pick it up. You're selling to an end user, so you're shrinking your buyer pool, you're shrinking its value on the market. And look, this is essentially what rent control does. Rent control is forcing you to raise the rent even on good tenants, just so you can do whatever you can to protect the value of the asset. So raise the rent every year, do accompany it with a letter as to why you are doing it. You can cite the expenses, whatever it might be. I think that tenants should be understanding it's a small amount of a rental increase. Everything else is going up. Inflation is going up at a much higher clip than you're going to raise the rent. And again, protect that resale value, because if you get into that mindset of, I have a great tenant, I just want to make it easy on them, one day you're going to go to sell that property and you may not be happy with what the real estate agent tells you it's worth based on that tenancy in place. All right, so the final step after you've had the discussion with the tenant to see if you actually need to list the property, after you've incentivized them to help the showing schedule, after you've been raising rents each year, you've had the cleaners in there, you're not overpricing the listing. This is the most important step, and the most important tip I have for you is you have to handle this entire process with grace and respect. I can't tell you, what it means for a tenant, how difficult it is on a tenant, and I see it on a day-to-day basis, to be displaced from their home, that level of shock that they have, that they're going to have to go through this process. For a lot of tenants, again, with the way the rental market is and the way interest rates have climbed, a lot of these tenants are in a place and within 1 year they're out and having to find another place. And with prices 10 to 15% higher, it's extremely difficult, disruptive, scary. Insert any negative adjective. It's a terrible experience for the tenant. From the seller side, it's a difficult experience because we can't cover the expenses. So as much as it's difficult on the tenant, seller needs to look out for themselves. The government's not looking out for either side because they're not creating affordable rentals for everyone, and yet they're putting the onus for rental rate increases to be so minimal on the landlord. They are acting like they're helping the tenant by doing so, but they're just displacing tenants. I don't want to get sidetracked. I can totally, rant on the rental situation for hours and hours. But what I do want to say is this whole process, you have to handle it with respect. You have to handle it with grace. You have to try and put yourself in the shoes of a tenant. And that's why whenever I'm selling tenant-occupied properties, I really do my best to be sympathetic, empathetic with the tenant as well, making sure that I'm doing the best job for the seller, because again, that's my role. That's what I'm legally responsible to do. But if I can help the tenant in some sort of way to make it easier. Now here in BC, you need a separate license to work on the property management side. Unless it's your own property, I can manage my own properties, but not other people's. I can't do tenant placement services, but of course I have a network of real estate contacts that can do this. So I will always offer that for tenants that are being displaced, to connect them with the right groups, to send them what the current rental rates are in the different neighborhoods. I subscribe to several reports that gives me this data. Anything that I can do to make it easier on the tenant, even after the sale is firm. We have a firm deal in place, subjects removed. I still try and do whatever I can to make it easier on that tenant. At the end of the day, we're all humans. Everyone is trying to survive. Everyone has financial pressures. So just keep that in mind when you're going through this process. Yes, you're under pressure, but so is the tenant. So keep that in mind. I hope you guys found some value in this video. If you did, hit the like button, because what that does is it takes the video and it sends it out to more people so they can learn from it as well. Also, if you like this weekly real estate content, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss next week's video. And again, if you're in the Vancouver area, perhaps you're thinking about selling a tenant-occupied property, one of your rental units, or you're thinking of buying a unit and you want to talk to me one-on-one, you can book me in the Calendly link below. But if it's easier for you, you can just send me a text, give me a call, shoot me an email, whatever is easiest for you. I'd be happy to chat with you one-on-one. But once again, I want to thank you guys for watching this week's video, and I look forward to seeing you next week.